The stench of sleaze is growing ever stronger in the UK. The ruling Conservative Party has received millions from Russian donors who are out to launder their reputations and ill-gotten gains. It's frustrating the United States, which believes sanctions against Russia would be blunted by Britain's tolerance for corrupt money. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Shuli Ghosh. The City of London has long stood accused of laundering billions of dollars in illicit money. The government estimates $135 billion of corrupt money flowed into the UK in 2016 alone. But it's not just Russian money that's corrupting politics. Members of Parliament have second jobs and act as consultants. Providing they declare their activities, they're considered to have broken no rules. A third of MPs have pocketed payments while working with private firms. In the 12 months to March 2020, they took home £4.9 million between them. The government's been accused of selling seats in the upper chamber of Parliament, the House of Lords, to donors for up to $4 million, according to Open Democracy and the Sunday Times. The Department of Health incurred losses of more than $8 billion on deals to buy personal protective equipment at the height of the COVID pandemic. Deals a High Court judge ruled were made unlawfully. Which begs the question, why is all this being described as sleaze and not corruption? Let me introduce today's guests. Joining us in London, we have Dr. Gabriel Apata, research scholar and writer who has written about corruption. In Oxford, we have Liz David-Barrett, Professor of Governance and Integrity at the University of Sussex. And in Manchester, we have Martin Bull, Professor of Politics in the School of Arts, Media and Creative Technology at the University of Salford. Welcome all of you to the studio. So let's talk about this differentiation in using the term sleaze or corruption. Martin, let me come to you first. Government scandals, of course, nothing new, but some of the ones the government seems to be involved in involve shady contracts, MPs being intimidated, billions of dollars being written off. Why is that referred to as sleaze rather than corruption?
Well, in definitional terms, sleaze was traditionally defined as sordid, immoral, corrupt activity. But over time, I think what's happened is that corruption has been defined fairly clearly as the abuse of public office for private gain. That's quite a serious accusation. And I think what's happened over time is that this word sleaze has become more generic. The idea of questionable, dodgy behavior or ethical lassitude. It's a means by which a dodgy behavior can be categorized, somebody can be accused of it, without going so far as to accuse them of being corrupt.
Liz, let me come to you because you're a professor at the University of Sussex and their Centre for the Study of Corruption says Boris Johnson's administration is more corrupt than any UK government since the Second World War, and absolute failure of integrity at number 10 could have potentially serious consequences for the UK if allowed to fester. I mean, they're very strong words. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I think we've definitely seen a lot more corruption around this government than we've seen for many years and in many different forms. So we've seen with these parties this not thinking that the rules apply to you. That's one thing. But we've also seen, I think, really serious abuses of power and just unwillingness to allow yourself to be scrutinised and held to account by other institutions. So there is a sense, I think, in the Johnson administration that it's okay to not just ignore the rules, but to change the rules to suit yourself.
Gabriel, what do you make of this word sleaze? Does it hide the scale of the problem?
Yes, I think it does. What has happened is that I think it's the best way to look at this is to set it in context. Corruption has to do with particular kind of behavior or practices. Corruption itself is a monster, it's a baggy monster of a concept, but we can still work through in terms of identifying certain behavior that falls under the category of corruption. with sleaze, it's a very difficult a concept to unravel. It just ranges over different kinds of behavior types. So, for instance, sleaze might refer to an atmosphere, a condition, or a state of affairs, but it doesn't actually relate to a particular kind of behavior. So, for instance, you may have something like a sleazy bar, but it doesn't tell you what goes on in that bar. So what sleaze does is that it disguises the behavior that you're trying to actually understand. So what happens with sleaze is that it's a benign way of actually describing corruption, rather than actually, using the more appropriate term, which is corruption. So
I was interesting, Gabriel, to hear, because I know you've written a lot about this, and you wrote an article on how the West invented African corruption. And the fact is that many African governments are perceived as being mired in bribery, corruption, misuse of public funds. But actually, it's happening here too.
Oh, yes, it is happening here. I mean, there are different kinds of corruptions, but we don't call it corruption here. And one of the reasons why I think we don't call it corruption is that we have the meaning of corruption has shifted over time. And what that means is that corruption has now come to define a particular kind of behavior by a particular kind of person or persons. So what that means is that corruption has now been nativized, which means that it is a kind of disease or cancer which is innate in some people. But here we don't use corruption because we think that it doesn't apply to us. Corruption is endemic in Africa, but here it is episodic. By that I mean that when you use the term sleaze, you're really not actually saying anything other than that it's like common code, for instance. Whereas with corruption over there is something more endemic. So somebody who is corrupt is diseased in a particular sense.
That's a really interesting perspective. Martin, I wonder how people, the public, are perceiving what's happening within the British government, because for example, the issue of Partygate. Partygate has had a lot of media coverage lately, but arguably there are much more serious issues. For example, the laundering of Russian money.
Yes, absolutely, and it's that's an area in which the British government is not performing very highly, obviously, because it's currently coming under pressure to change or rather enact legislation to make that more difficult. The interesting thing I think about Partygate is that it shows the power of scandal. Scandal becomes almost a separate thing from the original corruption. So the degree of scandal that is produced is not necessarily always related to the seriousness of the corruption that has occurred or the sleaze that has occurred. And I think the current scandal is very representative of that. What we've seen is the prime movers, the suspects, the subjects, losing control over the agenda. The scandal has become mediatized, and it's going through cycles in which secondary transgressions are almost as serious as the original transgression, if the original transgression occurred, and the jury is still out on that. Secondary transgressions occur really through denials, and that's a pattern of behavior we've seen in this government, and Liz has mentioned it. So something occurs, the media catches up on it, there's a denial, and that denial then does not hold water. And what happens then is a kind of cycle, and the scandal gets worse.
Yeah, Liz, would you agree with that? The power of scandal, it gathers a momentum. The government try to contain it, they try to distract, they try to stonewall, but it, in the end, becomes more damaging than perhaps some of the more serious accusations that are being levelled at the government?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you did see, when we talk about that concept of corruption, often that is something, as as Gabriel has said, that we associate with other countries, and we're not willing to say that in Britain we have that kind of corruption. But that's partly because often, we're thinking about corruption as handing over little brown envelopes, or needing to pay something to get your passport, and that kind of thing you don't see much of in the UK. But there's a much deeper kind of improper influence that's going on in the background often, which is very prevalent in the UK and in a lot of Western countries. And that's about narrow interest groups who've got really exclusive and excessive access to the people in power, and are able to influence decisions about how contracts are given out. We've seen that with the PPE procurement. They can influence how laws are made and regulation, and also influence decisions about how budget money is allocated. So we've seen that recently with the Conservative whips threatening, or at least allegations that they've threatened MPs that if they don't stand behind Johnson, if they're not loyal to him, then their constituencies won't get funding from the government. Now, those are really serious abuses of power for private or narrow gain. And so I think they would definitely fit with the definition of corruption. But it's taken quite a long time for that narrative to build up, I think, because people were used to thinking about corruption as something that happens elsewhere. So it's only really with the accumulation of stories that has started to sink in for people, that that's a really worrying abuse of power.
Yeah, and just as a side note, you mentioned handing over money in brown envelopes. Of course, that is one of the scandals that affected an MP, Neil Hamilton, back in the 90s. So those kind of scandals just seem to keep on happening. Let's talk about what impact scandal has on a government. The impact on the Prime Minister is clear. Of course, there are growing calls for him to go.
But I expect my leaders to shoulder the responsibility for the actions they take. Yesterday, he did the opposite of that. So I'll remind him of a quotation altogether too familiar to him of Leo Amery to Neville Chamberlain. You have sat there too long for all the good you have done. In the name of God, go.
Gabriel, when a leader's authority has been so eroded and so damaged, like Boris Johnson's has, can he do anything else but resign?
Well, he can try and tough it out. The problem is that as in the Analects, Confucius says that to one of his disciples, Sun Kun, that three things that are needed for government are weapons, food, and trust. But the most important of these is trust. And the moment trust goes, everything collapses, because everything is built around trust.
Can you regain that trust? Can Boris Johnson do anything to regain that trust at this point?
Well, I'm not sure what he can do. The problem with trust is that once it goes, it's really very difficult to recover. The damage is sometimes, irreparable. He can try, but the only option that's left, he can stay in office, but the people would have made their decision, I would think.
Yeah, I think that question of public trust in the people who are elected to lead you and make decisions for the country, particularly at a difficult time like the COVID pandemic, is absolutely paramount. Martin, what do you think? Very
clearly, let me say that I think that the issue here, the story is very representative of the discussion we've just been having about the difference between corruption and sleaze. And the assumption is always that corruption somehow is obviously very serious, and that sleaze you can kind of get away with. Well, I think this government is showing that that's not possible. If you go back in time, and you mentioned the cash for questions scandal, that of course led to a big reform. various reforms in UK politics. Well, one of those was the establishment of the Nolan Principles. Now, the Nolan Principles really were a recognition that corruption can be dealt with, yes, by rules, by a prosecutorial type of approach. But in the end, the problem was how you deal with behavior which might lay the foundation for corruption but not actually be corrupt. And so if you look at the Nolan Principles, selflessness, integrity, objectivity, accountability, openness, honesty, and leadership by example. What you see here is an example of a prime minister and a government falling shy of those principles and paying price. So when you ask the question, can he regain trust? He can stand there and say, I'm not corrupt, my government's not corrupt, and argue about the particular incidents. But ultimately, the public will judge him on the sort of principles that Nolan established. And that's why I think the future for Prime Minister Johnson and his government is bleak.
Liz, just on this subject of standards of behaviour, of course, these standards were set out for MPs to adhere to. We had a situation recently where an MP was criticised for his role as a consultant to a company which benefited financially from contracts with the COVID pandemic. And the Prime Minister tried to change the rules when there was scrutiny on that MP, Owen Paterson. So here we have a Prime Minister who not only doesn't live up to the standards, but tries to throw out the rule book when his cronies come under scrutiny.
Absolutely, and I think that's part of the difficulty here in terms of when we talk about rebuilding trust. You know, if something goes wrong, then you look to see how that's dealt with by the government, and you want to see that they're taking responsibility, that they're apologising, maybe that they're changing the system so that it can't happen again. Instead, what we repeatedly see actually under the Johnson administration is something goes wrong, they try to pretend it hasn't gone wrong, they refuse to apologise, and then they don't change the system. Or as in that case where a Conservative MP was found to have breached the rules about paid lobbying, they did try to change the rules, but they tried to change the rules so that they actually would have created a new system for monitoring the conduct of MPs that was dominated by their own party, chaired by someone from their own party, didn't have cross-party support, and it was throwing out the whole system that had been built up over the years and that was, you know, respected, and nobody had been saying that there was a problem with it before. So, you know, instead of taking responsibility, acting with integrity, we've got this kind of cover-up mentality. How can we change things so that we don't fall down on this before in terms of getting caught, not in terms of not doing it?
Mm. And Martin,
can I just...
Sorry, go ahead, Gabriel.
Yes, I just wanted to come in there. I think part of the problem here is that as Liz says, it's this attempt to diminish the severity of corrupt practices. Ever since Watergate, there's always been this notion that any public crisis or affair has a gate added to it. So by calling it, you know, Partygate, for instance, the emphasis appears to rest on the party rather than the initial rule breaking. So by calling these things scandals, it appears to suggest that we're outraged by them, and it's the outrage that is the problem, rather than the process of sort of not living to the public standard to which you know, we hold our trustees or the official office holders.
But isn't the end result the same, no matter what it is that the public are getting outraged about, or that the media have picked up with and have you know, really hammered the British government about Partygate? Isn't the end result the same? What do you think, Martin? That what we are demanding is a proper response or some better behaviour from the government?
Well, I think my answer to that is to distinguish between the two offences, and I think the Gabriel was right to draw attention to that. The interesting thing at the moment is that the original transgression was apparently an alleged breach of COVID rules. It was a breach of the law. And what we've seen happen is that the political side of this has been trumped by the police. So it's almost as if, of course, the higher law must dominate here, and that is that we must establish whether or not the law was broken. But actually, when you look at the situation, it is actually the political side which is far more important for public office holders. Now, maybe for you and me, if we break the law, then we have to pay the £100 fine or the £10,000 fine or whatever it is. But when it comes to public office holders, that's not the most important thing. The most important thing is whether or not there were transgressions in the political sphere. And the key issue here is whether or not Parliament was misled. And that's why this story has not yet panned out. It may be that the politicians or the ministers or the Prime Minister are thinking that they can get away with a breach of the law. I think far more serious in terms of corruption is the misleading of Parliament. And that's the thing that we've got to wait on.
Yeah. And I wonder what you all think about the question of, does all of this impact on the credibility of our government when it stands up and criticises other countries for their practices? So when it points to, corruption in Russia or Afghanistan or even African countries, actually what's going on at home makes their criticism hold much less water. What do you think? What do you think, Liz?
Yeah, I think that's a big problem. And at a moment when Britain is trying to remake a lot of its relations with the rest of the world after Brexit, I think it's quite worrying that actually the reputation of British democracy, which has been seen as a key strength of British identity for many years, is really being put into question and weakened. So I think that's a great pity. Again, what we're seeing here is not just questions about wasted money, but also opening up questions about how much decisions are being distorted, really. And
it's about transparency, isn't it? And I know you talk to a lot of governments, a lot of foreign governments, about how to improve transparency. Our own government is clearly falling down on that.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are many governments, for example, that have been much more transparent about their COVID procurement. There's no reason why the UK couldn't have been. So it often is hiding behind the emergency and the seriousness and urgency of dealing with a pandemic. But actually, plenty of governments have managed to be much more open about how they're spending public money during that time. They haven't completely done away with competition. They've still managed to let contracts competitively. So Britain's really in danger of losing its reputation there. And as you say, when I go and talk to other governments, it's a pity not to be able to point to the UK as having high standards.
Yeah, exactly.
Can I just give I fully agree with what Liz has just said, but maybe what we could say is we should also be thankful for scandal. If you look at countries which have systemic levels of corruption, or even say non-democratic countries, you don't usually find corruption. Where we find there is a scandal, we should remember that it's also a sign of health. It's a sign of a free society. It's a sign that democracy is actually working. And it means that reforms should and probably will follow, whether it be in relation to rules and laws or in relation to behaviour.
Well, final quick word to you, Martin. Just on that point, do you think things are getting better, though? Because back in the 90s, as we said, we had lots of revelations involving ministers Neil Hamilton and cash for questions, Jonathan Aitken having his hotel bill paid by the Saudis. I mean, endless affairs and secret love trials. Are things getting better, or is it same old, same old?
Nothing of the parliamentary expenses scandal, which was a watershed moment, and it was viewed as a watershed moment, the moment in which trust in politics, in politicians, began its long decline and has continued to do so. That was a monster of a scandal, mainly because it involved almost all of the so-called political class. Here we're talking about a scandal that involves government more than Parliament. Indeed, Parliament is on government's back here. But nevertheless, the issue is as serious. And I think what it does raise big questions is to the view is somehow we can get over corruption, we can stop it happening. We have to remember that in a lot of observers' eyes, corruption is endemic. It's always been there and will always be there. You know, we can control opportunity, we control incentive, we can control risk through rules and regulations. The one uncontrollable element in relation to corruption is personal honesty.
Thank you, all of you, for joining me. It's one of those subjects that I really would like to talk a lot more about, but unfortunately we've come to the end of the show. So thank you very much indeed, Gabriel, Liz and Martin. And don't forget, you can see more discussion and debate on our YouTube channel. Search for Roundtable TRT World. But for now, from me and all the team here, bye-bye. Thanks for watching.